Well, let's get started then. Welcome, Dylan and Cala. And if we want to just start with both of you kind of briefly introducing yourselves, I'll start with Cala. Welcome, Cala, to the podcast, and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Always good to, talk about Cuba and share what we experienced firsthand in the Cuban Revolution. So I'm 18 years old. I am a member of the Young Communist League in Boston, where I grew up. And right now I'm living in Montreal, Quebec for university, where I'm in my first year studying history. And I'm also one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, which is a nationwide organization with over 50 member organizations. And we serve as an umbrella for the Cuba Solidarity movement in the US. We are working to lift the US blockade and end the US war on Cuba. And we have a lot of amazing member organizations, including CPUSA and many other socialist parties and anti-war organizations and peace organizations. So yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you again for having me.
Excellent. And Dylan.
Yeah, thanks for, like Calla said, thanks for inviting us. It's a really good opportunity anytime to get to talk about Cuba and solidarity initiatives with Cuba that are increasingly important in this country. And so, this is a very exciting opportunity for us. I'm Dylan, I'm 25 years old. I went to Cuba as a journalist for the People's World. And so I have an article out and I did a video on the election day that went on. And so you can find that on, CPUSA social media. And I am also CPUSA's NNOC representative. And so, I get to work with Cala a bit in that capacity as well. And yeah, it was a really exciting trip. It taught me a lot. It was my first time in Cuba. Cala had been before. And so, it's really helpful to get to see and experience these things and also have people like Cala who were there before and kind of had some context going in to kind of enrich the experience even more. So I'm very excited to get to talk about it. And yeah, thank you again for giving us this space.
Absolutely. So let's start with just kind of the nature of the trip. I know it was a collaboration with the Young Communists of Cuba. So kind of how did this come about and how did you guys get involved in it?
Yeah, so I guess I'll jump on that one. But this was a Building Our Future youth meeting that was hosted by the Union of Young Communists in Cuba, Unión de Jóvenes Comunistas. They're basically their YCL. And they invited, activists from all over the United States. They really wanted to have some productive dialogue between, activists here in the United States working for Cuban solidarity, as well as, their young activists in Cuba working to lift the blockade from within their country. That cooperation is very important and they understand that. And so they wanted to help foster some dialogue. And so, it was a really good experience as far as the things we got to do. And, we'll go into more detail about that a little bit later. But Cala is also, and she'll speak more later, a member of the NNOC, and the NNOC, National Network on Cuba, is very intimately involved with the Young Communists in Cuba, as well as many other Cuban solidarity networks. And so it's this big conglomeration of all these groups that were coming together solely for Cuban solidarity. So you had a lot of different left groups from the United States who were all there for one purpose, and that one purpose was to unite for Cuba. And Calla, if you want to expand on some of that.
Yeah, I'd just add that, what is so incredible about Cuba and being a young person in Cuba is that young people can participate in mass organizations like the Young Communist League, as well as the Federation of University Students and the Federation of High School Students, which also helped organize this youth meeting. And through these, institutions that are built into the revolutionary government, hundreds of thousands of young people really play a role at the forefront of the revolution, which gave them the ability to invite dozens and dozens of US students to come and partake in this kind of event. So it was really incredible. It was, you know, really led and pushed by the Cuban youth, full-time students who managed and organized this entire week-long event and coordinated dozens and dozens of people flying in from across the US to Cuba, and they worked so hard to pull it off. And we're so grateful that we had the opportunity to spend this time with them and that they were such gracious hosts to us.
So Calla, how did you get involved in Cuban solidarity work? Because I know Dylan mentioned you had been before. What kind of led you to fall into this this work?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with where I learned about Cuba because, you know, I think most people growing up in the US don't really hear much truth about Cuba at all. And I remember the first positive and truthful things I read about Cuba were reading Assata Shakur's autobiography. And Assata is an escaped political prisoner, a Black revolutionary who was involved in the Black liberation movement in the US, who got asylum in Cuba to escape persecution by the US government after they framed her and through the COINTELPRO program, suppressing these revolutionary movements. And she got asylum in Cuba and wrote in her autobiography about what an incredible revolutionary society it was, how they lacked so many of the problems that we have, you know, inside of the US empire, from institutional racism to individualism to class exploitation, and how Cuba, even as a very young revolution, you know, still working to develop out of its, you know, colonial based structure that existed for hundreds of years before the revolution, that it had made so much progress in removing exploitation and building a more just society. And I became very interested in Cuba. I wanted to be able to travel there and see it firsthand. I started reading a lot of Che and Cuban history. And then I found out that there was a local Cuba Solidarity Committee where I lived in Boston called July 26, the Boston Cuba Solidarity Coalition. And at the very first meeting I went to, I immediately felt like I was at home. I met incredible comrades who really welcomed me into the group as the youngest person who had joined. And many of these people have been traveling to Cuba and working in solidarity with Cuba for decades and decades, for over half a century. I met a woman named Marian Sara who lives in Cuba half the year, and she was actually in the very first Venceremos Brigade to Cuba, which is the longest lasting solidarity brigade. And Mary told me about her experience, and she encouraged me to try to come to Cuba on the May Day Brigade, which is the brigade that NNOC organizes every year for Cuba's incredible May Day celebration, which is a really important holiday for workers. And I really wanted to go. I convinced my parents. I managed to work it out so that I could take some time off school, since this was during my senior year of high school. And we also started fundraising to raise money so that I could afford to go and so that we could provide scholarships to other young people. And I went to Cuba for 18 days in April and May, and it was really life-changing. Being able to see US propaganda fall apart before my own eyes and to come back to the belly of the beast with these firsthand experiences that I could share with my community was incredible, because having that knowledge and having those experiences, we can explain, one, how harmful US policy is to Cuba and how everything that we hear about that's so bad in Cuba and the, you know, the economic suffering is not caused by socialism. It is caused by the US blockade, the genocidal US blockade that the entire world, except the US empire, is morally and politically opposed to. And it also is important. The second reason, I think, is because we need to bring back the truths about the Cuban Revolution to the US to show what is possible in building socialism and building a mass movement of people here in the belly of the beast as well. So Cuba shows us what's possible in that aspect. And living in the US, living in a society that is so steeped with exploitation and violence and racism and hatred, being able to see another construction of society that is possible was like one of the most incredible, you know, experiences of my entire life, and really what was so important for me to bring back. And we hosted many report backs, and I wrote articles once I got back, and we really tried to share as much as possible with people so they can see what life is like in Cuba. And I ended up getting, even more involved after being in Cuba firsthand, and, meeting so many amazing Cuban comrades who need our support and need us to be using our positions as, people with anti-imperialist consciousness in the belly of the beast to be organizing to lift the blockade and to support the Cuban people. So I became one of the co-chairs of NNOC in early November, and then a couple weeks later, I got to go to Cuba again with Dylan and with the youth delegation. And now we're, starting to move into the new year, and I think there's really more momentum building than ever in solidarity with Cuba, especially an intergenerational movement, as all these young people are getting involved and learning from our older comrades who have been in the struggle for a long time. So, well, that was longer than I intended, but everyone, should consider getting involved in, just going to one event, going to a brigade, going and learning about Cuba, reading a book. It can really change your entire perspective and bring you into this work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like one of the big misconceptions, and a few months ago we had the international conference, and there was some presentations that were about Cuba, and I heard from so many people that said that they didn't even realize that people from the US could go to Cuba. So I guess like that leads me to this logistical question of just what was the process like to get, do you have to get visas? Do you just go with a passport? How does that work?
Yeah, I think for me, I got a journalism visa for People's World, and so you have like 13 approved like visas for getting to Cuba that the U.S. still allows. And one of those, which I think a lot of the brigades went on, was through the Friends of the Cuban People visa, and that's just general support for Cuban people. And if you take part in these brigades, they'll typically help you handle all of this. The main requirement from the United States government is that you have to go with a like a tour agency in Cuba, and like so they'll have that all set up for you if you go through one of these brigades, specifically with the National Network on Cuba. They coordinate a lot of these, and the organizations within the network do as well. And so it's definitely possible. Some of the restrictions were definitely heightened after Obama tried to roll them back a bit. And so, there's still some things you have to deal with. And, there are always stories about being kind of harassed a little bit at the airport when you're coming back from Cuba. Thankfully, I didn't have to deal with any of that. And I haven't really heard of too many people who have had to deal with much of that. So, I mean, there's ways to get there. You have to be conscious of how you're going to pay for things, because credit cards don't work. So, that's all part of it. But if you join one of these brigades, they're going to be able to help you navigate all of that. And yeah, and that's one of the most important things too about going with a group like that, is a lot of these really tricky things they have so much experience dealing with, and that will make it very, very easy for you to be able to take part of these solidarity initiatives.
It's just fascinating to me that this island is what, like 90 miles south of Miami, and it's so isolated because of the sanctions that credit cards don't work. Do you have phone service? How does all of that work? I mean, what were kind of the big moments for you, Dylan, that I guess struck out immediately when you got there about things that maybe just we take for granted?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, phone service is kind of difficult for sure. The blockade keeps Cuba from being able to tap into the fiber optic cables that that are on the bottom of the ocean that travel, across the ocean to the other countries to give people internet access, right? So things can be tricky. The economic blockade definitely, makes those things a little difficult. I mean, but really, the quality of life in Cuba, well, I mean, I didn't really have any major problems, there's one thing to definitely be aware of, that there is a dire economic situation in the country right now, which is why this solidarity work is so important. The pandemic really, really hurt Cuba's economy, which was very fueled by tourism. And, since then, it hasn't really been able to recover. And so, we're seeing one of the most dire economic situations in Cuba since the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union. But with that being said, I didn't really have too many issues with anything. We were very well taken care of. But I mean, this is a good segue though to talk about a little bit about the things that Cuba has to deal with, but they're still able to provide for their people in the way that the U.S. does not. And one of those things is definitely being like healthcare. Cuba is dealing with these sanctions and this economic warfare, essentially. If we're going to be honest about what it is, from the largest country, most richest country in human history. And yet they were able to build a very robust biotechnology industry that leads the world in many ways. They developed innovative vaccines for things like cancer and medicines for diabetes that are like really innovative and unique and needed in the medical community. And so despite all of these things that are pushing against them, this small island of 13 million people is able to really advance in these spaces and also provide a standard of living for their people. There's just always this comment. We when I was down there, we met with a lawyer, a very liberal lawyer, who was against the blockade but didn't really like the Cuban government. And when we were driving through Havana, he was like showing us intentionally like people standing in line for food. And he's like, see, like this is what Cuba's like, people stand in line for food. It's like, oh great, I'm glad that they have a place to go get food, because in the United States, they just sit on the street corner and die. Like there's no place for them to get anything, So, there's these weird narratives that people pull out of Cuba, and so it's really good to go see for yourself. Because when I see those people standing outside for food, I'm like, okay, great. The economic situation is pretty bad right now, but people are still able to access food. They're able to go to their grocery stores and get what they need. And so there's a lot to be said about the advancements that Cuba has made. And it's really inspiring. I mean, in Cuba's work that they do, specifically in the medical field, if they can't even really release their research into like common international medical journals because of this economic blockade. The economic blockade really goes so deep. And so there's a lot of doctors around the world, a lot of medical researchers who really don't know what's going on in Cuba. And during that time when Obama lifted sanctions a bit, Cuba was able to establish a partnership with a university in New York, who is trying to work with Cuba on some of the research, specifically with the lung cancer vaccine. And so, there is some cooperation going on now, but of course, Trump put Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list shortly before he left office. And, a really big part about that is we can't just remove the economic blockade and still keep Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list. Like both have got to go, because both come with their own set of restrictions. And so that's a really big push right now that's happening within the National Network on Cuba, is to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. But then, of course, also removing the blockade. But both of those very necessary for them to go. And I'm sure Calla can expand more on that if she would like to.
Yeah, I'll just add a little. I echo everything you said, and it's important to remember just how comprehensive and widespread and wide-reaching the blockade and all hostile U.S. policy against Cuba is. The blockade is not just one bill that we need to overturn. It is like hundreds and hundreds of different sanctions and pieces of legislation that are designed to crush the Cuban economy and to target the most vulnerable parts of the Cuban economy, targeting medical care, preventing food from being imported. This is why the blockade is considered genocidal under international law. And Trump added 243 new additional sanctions, almost all of which Biden has kept. So this isn't Trump's blockade anymore. It is Biden's, and he is choosing to uphold it, just like all U.S. presidents have in the past since it was first instated in the 60s. And to talk about the state sponsors of terrorism list, I think this is one of the most bizarre and hypocritical aspects of all U.S. policy on Cuba. The being classified as a state sponsor of terrorism is one of the most serious and harmful classifications that exists, because no banks or institutions or corporations can risk doing business with countries that might be considered under international law or by the US empire, the most powerful economy and country in the world, as a sponsor of terrorism. There is no evidence that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. The three justifications that the Trump administration used and that the Biden administration has continued to uphold is that, one, Cuba mediated between the Colombian government and between rebels in Colombia, and they actually received much international praise for the role that they played in mediating this conflict towards peace. So absolutely not a justification. The other justification is that Cuba is harboring fugitives. Like I mentioned earlier, Cuba has been a place of political asylum for many escaped political prisoners, especially Black revolutionaries from the US and other countries, but they have not had any political asylums from the US for over 30 years. And obviously these people are fleeing an oppressive, violent government that is persecuting them, so they deserve to have a place to go. And third, they've justified putting Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list because of their support and recognition of Nicolás Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, and said that somehow their support of him is encouraging terrorist activity, which again is just bizarre and so wide-stretched. But what's most angering to me about Cuba being on the state sponsor of terrorism list is the hypocrisy, because the US has committed countless terrorist acts against Cuba over its history. Plane bombings, the worst act of terrorism in the Western Hemisphere before 9/11 was considered the bombing by Cuban exiles of a Cuban plane that killed hundreds of people. And these murderers were harbored by the US and never prosecuted and continue to live freely today. There were dozens and dozens of hotel bombings. The US has committed biological warfare over Cuba, destroying crops, spreading diseases. And obviously the US invaded directly during the Bay of Pigs. And the US and the CIA-funded groups and Cuban exile groups in Miami continue to encourage terrorism and violence in Cuba today to try to overthrow the revolution. We especially see that through social media. So it is just completely unjust and hypocritical when clearly the US and the US military are the biggest sponsors of terrorism in the world, and Cuba is incredibly peaceful. Like Dylan mentioned, Cuba's medical system, Cuba's entire diplomatic philosophy is we export doctors, not bombs. Cuba has the most doctors per population in the world, and they send hundreds of thousands of doctors to countries that don't have enough medical services to serve there and to help the communities. And Cuba has upheld peace and aided, struggles against imperialist violence around the world. And that is why almost all, governments in Latin America have been calling for Cuba to be removed from this list. But of course, it is designed to devastate their economy and to even worsen the already terrible effects of the blockade. But the good thing that we can remember is that this is something Biden can change with the flick of a pen. So if we build up pressure and if we, raise awareness to the masses in the US of the injusticeness of Cuba being on this list and of the blockade and of US policy towards Cuba in general, this is really something we can work towards that would increase and make better daily conditions for Cuban people. So that is one thing that we learned a lot more about when we were there from everyday Cubans who have to live with the blockade every day of their lives and to suffer the effects. And it is really important that we start talking more about this and making people aware of the absolutely ridiculous decision to continue to keep Cuba on this list.
Yeah, they're on the list with Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Syria. And they've been on this list since 1982.
Okay, so I want to expand a bit too on what Calla said, because she was bringing up a lot of good points about how detrimental this blockade is for the Cuban people. But another thing that's very important for Americans to understand is that this blockade hurts all of us, right? It's detrimental to the Cuban people and it's detrimental to the American people as well. One thing Calla mentioned was the doctors that Cuba sends abroad. So where that brigade actually started was in, was it 2005? That was when the Hurricane Katrina hit. So Hurricane Katrina hit and, devastated, the South, Louisiana. I was living in Louisiana at that time. Alabama, and I think Mississippi as well. And Fidel gets together this brigade of, like thousands of doctors and like, tons of medical supplies, and they are ready to go to the United States. 1,600 medics, field hospitals, and 83 tons of medical supplies. And so they're ready to go to the United States and help the states that are affected. Cuba offered like unconditional support to ease the humanitarian disaster. They felt that their own experience dealing with the similar catastrophes at home and their proximity to the disaster, helped prepare them to provide the relief that these Americans needed. Well, the Bush administration denied Cuba's help, stating that the U.S. didn't need Cuba, because there's a robust response from their own American medical community. And they said, Cuba should worry less about what's going on in the States and offer your own people their freedom. And then this disaster becomes one of the worst disasters, the worst government responses in American history. I mean, FEMA and the government was just completely ridiculed for not showing up for the American people, for not showing up with the right supplies, for not showing up with enough doctors. I mean, these people, so many people died that really could have got help from, these 2,000 doctors that Fidel was trying to send over to help. And so, it's really disgusting. And then this whole time, they continually rejected Cuba's help. And so, eventually Fidel renamed the response team after a Brooklyn-born American Civil War soldier, Henry Reeve. He was a soldier who fought in the Civil War, but then also fought in Cuba's fight for independence from Spain. And he died fighting in Cuba. So there's a lot of respect for him and what he represents. And so they named this International Medical Response Team after Henry Reeve. And since then, I mean, it's grown to like almost 10,000 health professionals who have treated like 3.5 to 4 million people in over 21 different countries. I mean, they've responded to Ebola in West Africa. They've been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. They've always also been recognized by the UN for their work. And they're doing such incredible work. And this brigade of doctors started as an attempt to try and help the American people that our government rejected. And as a result, we didn't have near enough supplies or response that we needed, and many people died. And so that's a very literal example, from a historical moment. But even from the healthcare that me and Cala were discussing earlier, there are American citizens that try to travel to Cuba illegally to get treatment for lung cancer because they have the CIMAVAX lung cancer vaccine that the United States does not. This like radio silence, I guess, or this like not radio silence, but this intentional blockade from even collaborating with Cuba on things, it really, really hurts the Americans, it hurts Cubans. And there's just so many reasons to lift this Cold War era blockade that's just completely irrelevant, to our contemporary times and politics. And so it's sad to see how much this aggression towards Cuba has hurt Americans and has hurt Cubans and continually really hurts Cubans. And so that's really what's so important about this work right now is, Cuba needs to be as mainstream a conversation, freeing Cuba and ending economic warfare needs to be as mainstream a conversation on social media as freeing Palestine, right? Cuba and Palestine, they both even help each other in their struggles for liberation. Palestinian doctors, we actually met some medical students in Cuba at the Latin American School of Medicine. Some of the medical students were from the Gaza Strip, and they were going to return to, be doctors there, to kind of help Palestinians as they, deal with the oppression from, the Israeli military. And so all these struggles are connected, and in the United States, especially, we need to be very loud and very forceful with our demands, because we can really end the blockade in our lifetime. It's been 60 years, and it's time to end. And so what Cala said about this being Biden's blockade, it absolutely is. And with pressure, we can change this, and we need to. We need to help our comrades in Cuba. And so, yeah, with that, I'll end my piece there.
Just to add one small thing to what Dylan said, Cuba also tried to send thousands of doctors and supplies to the US after 9/11 and were also refused. And then George Bush designated Cuba as part of the axis of evil and increased US intervention and hostility and regime change attempts in Cuba. So again, this just shows the utter disregard for human life that the US empire and all capitalist states have compared to Cuba, which actually invests and prioritizes protecting human life. And we see that in the medical system. We see that in how after the COVID pandemic, Cuban life expectancy grew and surpassed that of the US, which fell by several years because of the utter mismanagement and disregard for human life during the pandemic.
It's such a classic US digging its heels in and feeling threatened. I think Rosanna mentioned that the reason we have such heavy propaganda is they don't want us to see what it's really like.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at what Cuba's healthcare expenditure is per capita compared to us, they have like, I think $1,000 per capita, right? In the US, in the US, our healthcare is like almost $11,000 per capita, right? So they have like almost 10 times, we have almost 10 times the amount spent on healthcare per person in this country. But Cuba actually has universal healthcare. Their citizens are actually able to access some of the highest quality Medicare in the world for free. I think like upwards of 90-something% of their population is vaccinated, like nearing 100. I won't say it because I don't have the data in front of me, but it's really up there. And they're able to do that with so much less, and so there was an interview we had with a medical student there named Iman, and Iman said, in the United States, they don't prioritize humanity. They don't prioritize their people. They prioritize their profit. But in Cuba, things that are priority get taken care of, and we saw that, right? And that's the importance of people really going to Cuba for themselves, so they can see these things too, and we can continue to combat these lies that are, honestly increasing to try and destabilize Cuba during this moment of economic uncertainty, which is classic American playbook.
Yeah, Rosanna is absolutely right that the reason the US doesn't want us to travel to Cuba is because they don't want us to see the reality of the situation there. And, some moments I felt like trying to explain what I saw to people in Cuba, to people in real life and online. It was quite sad seeing people's reactions of just not being able to believe that what is real in Cuba is possible. People would say, oh, like, they paid actors to pretend that they're like real Cubans who are happy with their system, and you were just seeing like staged sets, which obviously is not true. But it's sad to think that Americans have been so dehumanized by the exploitation and the oppression that they experience from our government that they can't even believe that a better world is possible. And I mean, if people did realize, if masses of people did realize that an entirely different construction of society is possible just 90 miles away from the US, one where housing is guaranteed, where education and healthcare are free, where racism and homophobia are outlawed, and equality is guaranteed and enshrined, they would be demanding those same things here. And that's why the US government doesn't want us to realize it's possible. And that's why it's so important, like Dylan said, that we go to Cuba and that we bring back these truths to ourselves.
Yeah, and I'll build on that too to say we should also be bringing laborers to Cuba, right? I mean, we should be working within our unions, and we should be trying to get, union members to Cuba to see these things, because Cala and I, we're involved in this work. We are constantly doing work in international spaces. But our workers here need to see what another government is able to provide with a whole lot less opportunity to their people, right? With the work that NNOC, resolutions have passed through city councils and unions, even in like the reddest of states like Alabama. I think the Alabama State Senate passed a resolution to calling for like medical and scientific collaboration between Cuba and the United States. It might have been a city council, but I think it was the state senate in Alabama. But the point is, these resolutions represent millions of people in the United States. I think the number was 62 million of unions and city councils that represent, these massive American people. So 62 million American people are represented by these resolutions that are in support of either removing the blockade from Cuba or increased scientific collaboration with Cuba. And so, I mean, that already tells you right there that the American people, they don't have this hostility against Cuba that the American government has. And when we were in Cuba, we heard a lot of the same, is that, Cubans don't have this hostility towards the American people. It solely is the American government that is perpetuating this, and it's not a popular policy. I mean, it costs us money. There's even the U.S. Department of Commerce released, a study in like 2004, and I'll try and find that, but they released a statement talking about how much money American business lost by not by having to work within the limitations of this blockade. So I mean, support for Cuba is something that we can make very popular, and very among just regular American people that might be a little apolitical, because there are material benefits from opening relations with Cuba, from learning about their healthcare system, from actually being able to access their medicine. And, and that's a really big part of it too, is, in the United States, we have these large corporations that have monopoly over these medicines and these medical treatments and such. So what happens when you introduce this lung cancer vaccine from Cuba into the US market, right? What happens to the profits of these corporations? And so these are questions that we should be bringing up, as we continue to advocate for Cuba and speak to regular people about this. There's a very outsized narrative about how quote unquote Americans feel about Cuba, because of this very strong, anti-Cuba, anti-Castro, Cuban voting bloc in Florida. All the politicians are pandering to this voting bloc. And, so it kind of gets an outsized voice in our narratives. But I think the reality that the work that the NNOC has showed us is that, collaboration with Cuba is popular. If 62 million Americans, are represented by some of these resolutions that they're passing, I mean, that is a very good sign to us that with continued pressure, we can really change things. And it's inspiring, but also, I mean, we still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And I think you hit on something there that I was thinking about with the material benefits, because if there's anything that enacts change in the US, it's economic, business related benefits. And so it almost seems like the business people, the capitalists, would love to have open trade with Cuba. They would love to. That's an untapped market for them. So it is kind of a self-defeating, cynically in that perspective. It's like, what are we doing? Why do we still do this? And so, Calla, you had written an article about the election, and I see that was, I guess, day 3 of this trip. You got to go during the election and witness that for yourselves. So that's a source of a lot of the myths and misconceptions that we hear in the US about Cuba, is that it's not a democracy. And so I wonder if you could speak to some of those big misconceptions and then what the reality is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got to observe Cuba's elections to the municipal assemblies of People's Power. That was the second to last day of the trip, I believe. All their elections are held on Sundays so that people aren't prevented from voting by their work days. And just to give kind of an overview of how the Cuban electoral and representative system works, there are the municipal assemblies of People's Power, and delegates are all chosen from the community and then voted upon. And there's also the National Assembly of People's Power, which is much bigger than our national legislature here in the US. And it has guaranteed seats like reserved for delegates who are elected, as well as guaranteed seats for certain sectors of like labor and groups that need to be represented. And from there, that's how they elect what I believe is called the Council of State, which is like a higher decision-making body, and that is what the president is part of. But we got to see the municipal elections, and I'd say to start with what the misconceptions are about elections and about democracy in Cuba. The idea that people have in the US is that Cuba is an absolute dictatorship, that there are no elections, that if there are elections, they are not competitive, that they are just hand-picked candidates by the Communist Party. And all of this could not be further from the truth. And in reality, Cuba is much more democratic than any capitalist democracy, especially the US, which of course is sliding in to fascism and seeing some of the worst voter suppression in the world. So in Cuba, everyone is automatically registered to vote starting at 16. And voter turnout rates are often over 90%. You know, people really come out and vote because they feel like their voices matter and participating in democracy is important. The process for picking delegates, like I said, happens in the community. These meetings are organized by community organizations like the Cuban Federation of Women and like the Committees in Defense of the Revolution. The Committees in Defense of the Revolution, over 80 or 90% of Cubans are members of these local community organizations, and they choose delegates based on how they have served their community and served their people. And then they are all put on the ballot and people go and vote. You know, the polling place doesn't look too different from what I've seen in the US, but the ballots, you know, are very simple and straightforward. And I'd say the biggest difference is the fact that there's no what we consider traditional campaigning in Cuba. In the US, elections are determined by campaigns and how much money candidates can afford to put into their campaigns to reach the most voters and turn people out. Whereas in Cuba, just the candidate biographies, which say their experience in serving the community, you know, their backgrounds, their membership in different organizations, short paragraphs, they're posted outside the polling place. Voters walk up to the polling place, read the information, go in and vote. It's very quick. And so different from the US, where super PACs and lobbyists essentially decide who gets to be elected. And there's a lot of other differences between elections in the US and in Cuba that I should also point out. One, that it is much faster to get the results than what we're used to in the US, where it can take weeks and weeks. Any public citizen in Cuba can participate in the counting of votes, and the ballot boxes themselves are not guarded by policemen or government officials. They are guarded by elementary school students from the communities who protect the ballots and really ensure that these elections are by and for the people. It's also really important to know that being a member of the Communist Party is not a requirement for running for office at all. It does not handpick candidates. And there is like real opposition and real discourse and decision-making and disagreement within the Cuban representative bodies and within the Cuban government. And another great example of that is the recent Families Code, which I think is one of the most exciting and incredible things and accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution in recent years. This family code was passed in September, approved by over 60% of the Cuban population, but the process to writing this package of legislation took place over the entire year. There were 79,000 community meetings leading up to the final drafting of the Families Code, where citizens could come and read the draft bill and give their input and make changes. And over 50% of the document ended up changing based on the inputs of the people. And the Families Code pertains to LGBTQ rights, to women's rights, to families' rights. In the Western media, it was mostly just portrayed as, oh, Cuba finally legalized gay marriage. But in reality, it was so much more than that. It completely redefined what the legal definition of a family is so that it is more inclusive to all kinds of families. one aspect of it that really stuck out to me is, the protections for queer people, LGBTQ people, which really bears stark contrast to the US, where politicians are promoting the mass murder of trans and queer people. In Cuba, if a parent tries to disown their child for being LGBTQ, that is considered an act of domestic violence, and it is punished as such. So there are really such strong protections. There's also, gender affirming care has been free for Cubans for years, which is so different than the US. And the constituent participation in this process is why this bill was so supported by the Cuban people, despite opposition from conservative groups and despite opposition from the Catholic Church. So that shows that there's real debate and disagreement within Cuba, despite what the US wants us to think, which is just that the government decides everything and there's no opportunity for debate or disagreement at all. And the fact that Cuba has a consultative process where citizens can directly give input to legislation and also to their constitution. Cuba revised and repassed their constitution in 2019 and had a similar process to that for the Families Code, with these neighborhood meetings where people can come and give their input and make direct changes. And that's just unimaginable to us in the US, where, queer rights and women's rights and abortion rights are decided by 9 unelected, lifelong serving Supreme Court justices, where our Constitution was written by a handful of slave owners who've never seen a light switch before. And somehow those laws are still considered as applicable and relevant to our lives today. But a socialist consultative democracy is what Cuba has, and they're constantly engaging and checking with the people to be sure that all these policies are representative of the people's wants and needs, and that it is not the government just leading and creating these policies and pushing them on other people, but it's really coming from the grassroots up, and that it is the masses who is pushing progress and social progress forwards.
Wow, so it's a participatory and direct democracy, and more democracy than we have in the US. So that's one myth down. And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I want to say, if people want to see what that looks like, CPUSA on the Instagram has a tagged video where, I went in with my camera and they allowed me to record the election process. I mean, I was in there as they were voting in the booth, as the scouts were taking the ballots, as they were getting registered. I mean, so you can see everything for yourself, and a lot of these myths that Cala busted, I think is very well summed up by one of the lovely people that we got to meet there in Cuba. Her name's Lil Maria. And Lil Maria told us, Americans can't think that they know Cuba because they talk to a descendant that hasn't been in the country in 30 years, right? This is our democracy in action. You have your camera, you're seeing it, you're recording it, bring this back and show this to people. Because they just talk to Cuban descendants that like she said, haven't been in the country in decades, and that's what defines the narrative on Cuba and the United States, and it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and so I think the healthcare issue is enormous, and I talked to Rosanna a little bit about it with regard to the different vaccines that are available, and one of the most ridiculous issues, I think, is that because of the blockade, they couldn't get syringes. And so their ability to vaccinate was delayed because of that. And other than that, they've got vaccines for lung cancer. They've got vaccines for diabetes. What else do they have, Dylan, or Cala, in terms of vaccines?
Yeah, well, I just want to jump in quickly and say that yes, the US blocked Cuba from accessing syringes, which delayed their vaccine rollout process after they developed many homegrown vaccines that young scientists innovated. But there was a huge solidarity campaign in the US led by global health partners, and NNOC helped with this, that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to send millions of syringes to Cuba. So that's another example of how important our solidarity work is. It's really, really life or death in the situation. And like you said earlier, Cuba has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Their COVID vaccines, they have, vaccinated kids at a younger age than many other countries, leading to much better prevention of the disease. They have also innovated many other vaccines. I'm not a woman in STEM, so I'm probably not going to remember everything perfectly, but I think they developed one of the first hepatitis B vaccines and preventions in the world, which is incredible. The lung cancer vaccine, of course, incredible diabetes treatments that could save hundreds of thousands of people from getting amputated every year in the US. Dylan, you wrote a whole article that like really summed this up so comprehensively. So what else am I missing?
Yeah, I'll expand on the diabetes medication you mentioned, because I mean that really is important. I mean, it's not as headline grabbing as lung cancer vaccine, but it's very important because diabetes is one of the leading killers of Americans, and it's increasing. So there's a statistic that out of the 200,000 amputations that occur annually in the United States, diabetic foot ulcers account for 130,000 of those amputations. So after an amputation, I mean, it's not just like, okay, your foot's gone, like, okay, like, you can live your life. I mean, after 5 years, there's a survival rate of 40%, and after 10 years, just 20% of those people survive. I mean, you're losing an entire, appendage of your body that is necessary for your daily activities. And there's all kind of health risks that come with that. And so what Cuba has developed is called Herbaprot P. And it's the only treatment that stops the growth of foot ulcers and saves patients from having to undergo these like life-threatening amputations. Now, our own National Institute of Health in the United States recognized Cuba for this Herbaprot P treatment. It was described as a novel product that provides an opportunity to address an important unmet medical need, right? So this is a health institution within the United States that is saying this, right? And so this isn't something people can dismiss with, oh, that's Cuban propaganda. It's like, okay, well, here you go. If you need a US primary source, like here you go, right? I mean, here it is in black and white. This is a novel product that meets an unmet need in the medical community. And these diabetic foot ulcers, it's a very serious problem, and it's increasingly becoming a problem for Americans. I think now it's specifically the 7th highest cause of death in the country. And our, patients in the United States don't have access to that. And and because of that, people are dying, right? I mean, out of 200,000 amputations, 130,000 were because of this medical issue that Cuba can actually help us treat. So, I only wonder, like, how many of those 130,000 people that, that have to get these diabetic foot amputations each year, how many of them got that, amputation unnecessarily? If they had access to this medicine, would diabetes still be the 7th highest cause of death for Americans in the United States? And these are very important things that we should be talking about. And I mean, there's other, there's other things that Cuba has been honored for. They won a gold medal award for developing, a synthetic vaccine against, I think it's HIB, that's Haemophilus influenza type B. And so, I mean, there's just a laundry list of things. If you do research on some of Cuba's biotechnology advancements, I mean, there's so many, and these are just the ones that we're highlighting, right? And so that should tell you, about what we are missing out on by not scientifically collaborating with Cuba. And there was a quote by one of the doctors that I got to interview at the Biomedical Center, and he said, the Sinovac vaccine, this is the lung cancer one. He says, the Sinovac vaccine will not outperform all of the therapies on its own, but it can significantly improve treatment available to lung cancer patients when used in conjunction with traditional therapies. So to him, this is the necessity of collaboration between the scientists of both countries, right? It's not this like, oh, Cuba's got a miracle cure. It's like, no, Cuba has this like really awesome medicine that if we can collaborate and combine this with traditional treatments, we can really help each other see some really great advancements for our patients, right? And so for him, he ended that interview, but before he left, he was like, science does not know politics. And I think that's a very important fact here. There are doctors all over the United States that are interested in Cuba, the ones that do know about the advancements they're doing, and the ones that don't know, I've sent my article in People's World, Americans Could Beat Lung Cancer if the U.S. lifted the blockade of Cuba. I've sent that to cancer researchers, right? People that I know in the States, and they know this field, and they had never heard of some of these vaccines, and so they were extremely impressed and about what Cuba's doing, and they were sharing it with all their colleagues that they do cancer research with, and those kind of things are what's going to put that what's going to help Cuba and push the fight a little bit more forward for us. It's a very, very broad appeal with some of these things that the NOC and that Cala and that CPUSA is fighting for in regards to helping Cuba.
I mean, it's amazing what science and medicine can do when it's not restricted by profit. And I think that's the big distinction between the US healthcare system, which is really a sick care system. It's about treatment, and there's no focus on preventative medicine, and there's no focus on any type of advanced research like this unless there's a profit motive. And I think that's like literally killing people. So I want everybody to read both of your articles, and I want people to find out where they can get more information and keep up with everything that's going on. But before we do that, I just want to pause and see if either of you have any other final words that you wanted to share, any other pieces of information, or anything that we missed, anything that really you think is important to share.
I don't think there's anything else. I would love to shout out some NNOC links and ways people can get involved.
Absolutely, yeah. But what can people do to keep up with the NNOC and get involved if they want?
So people should definitely go to NNOC.org. That's NNOC.org. If they want to learn more about the National Network on Cuba, we have a list of all of our member organizations, so you can find your local Cuba Solidarity group, or if you don't have one near you, you can find other groups that are involved or start your own. And that way you can tap into our ongoing activities, such as monthly caravans and standouts against the blockade. You can support passing resolutions to lift the blockade in your city council or in your labor union or in your student government. There are also some exciting events coming up. There is the International US-Cuba Normalization Conference in March, which is in person in New York City and also virtual. We will have, more information about that on our website and on our social media, but that's a great opportunity to hear directly from Cubans, which is such a rare opportunity to have in the US. We're lucky enough to have a delegation from Cuba, including many members of the Cuban UN mission and the Federation of Cuban Women, who travel to speak at this conference and to speak directly to us about their experiences and their movements as Cubans and as Cuban officials are very restricted by the US government when they come to the US. So it's a really important opportunity to be able to see them and hear from them directly. There's also the May Day Brigade in April and May. We have an interest form out for that on our website and our social media if people are interested in traveling to Cuba. May Day, you will see in March with millions of Cuban workers in defense of the revolution against imperialism, and you'll really see how the revolution is still alive, and you'll also get the chance to visit different workplaces and Cuban institutions and different parts of the country and learn directly from their experience and do voluntary work. And there are more brigades in the summer and in the fall and in the winter that we post about and advertise and encourage people to attend if you can't come in the spring. And we also have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, which you can find on our website or just by searching us up. I'd encourage people to follow us and check out our posts for regular education and news updates about Cuba from the perspective of trying to debunk imperialist propaganda about Cuba. And also to sign up for our email list where you can get information about our events. Like I mentioned, we're building a big year-long hopefully not longer than a year, but a big campaign to get Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. And we're going to need, all hands on deck to be mobilizing to build pressure on the Biden administration to undo this unjust policy. So if people have resources and talents they can offer to that campaign, if you can organize in your community and get your organizations involved, we need your support. Cuba needs your support. So I'd encourage people to get involved, and also people can reach out directly to me if they're struggling to find ways to tap in, because I'm one of the co-chairs and I can connect you with the groups that you need to be connected with. So it's NNOC.org.
Thanks,
And I'll add one more thing to that. All these resources that Cala is giving you to get people involved, assuming there's going to be people who are listening to this podcast that will get involved, when you have the opportunity to join one of these brigades and get to go to Cuba and see it firsthand, you then have the ability to write an article, take photos, do videos. Like if you go to Cuba, like bring something back and tell people about your experience. People's World will publish your stuff. You can send it to party of social media so we'll share it. Just be very intentional about not keeping your experience to Cuba. When you get back, write about it, talk about it, show people the reality, because we are in this battle of propaganda against this large US media apparatus, and we need grassroots support, and we need to be using social media to combat these narratives. So go and see it for yourself, but then also make sure you bring back what you saw.
Well, thank you guys so much. Dylan, I forgot to tell you my conspiracy theory about the lung cancer vaccine, but I have a theory, and it may not even be a conspiracy theory, that it's more profitable to treat cancer. I mean, the cancer treatment, it's a huge industry in the US. So it may be that they are actually not interested in a vaccine.
Right. I mean, in a for-profit medical system, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you for having us on. I appreciate you. I appreciate the International Department for, trying to combat these narratives that the US is putting out to demonize Cuba and its people. It's necessary work. And thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.